I don't think it's exactly passing the baton, say, from the United States to China, which is how it's often discussed. What I do think is true is that we're at the end of a 500-year cycle in history. And so you might ask, how did Europe conquer the Americas, which had native populations all through the Americas? And the answer was not military conquest primarily. They brought diseases, which the New World populations didn't know. So the New World was conquered by yellow fever, by typhus, by plague, by malaria, by other diseases brought by the Europeans. I'm thinking, as Donald Trump talks about narco-trafficking, he wouldn't like actually narcotics traffickers saying you have to open up your borders to our trade. But that's what the British did to the Chinese in 1839. And what ensued was the first Opium War.
Kishore Mahbubani, he was a great Singaporean diplomat, the founder of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Service in Singapore. And he started off his lecture to my students, and my students are graduate students in Paris, mostly European. So he started off with a hypothesis, which was a very interesting hypothesis. And he said, I asked him a question, does the future belong to Asia, Kishore? So he said, if I were giving this lecture 100 years ago, in 1925, I would say that Asia was the past, that Europe was the present, and that America was the future. But now it's 2025, and things have changed a little bit in the world. And now I can say that Europe is the past, and that America is the present, and that Asia is the future. This is what 100 years makes. So I'm going to start off by asking you whether you agree with Kishore, and whether you'd agree also with the our subtitle, which is Ready to Go, Asia Pacific Century Ready to Go, Go referring to an ancient and complex Asian game of Go, which is more complex than chess, and which is all about strategic patience and long-term vision, rather than aiming at decapitating the enemy's king, the way chess works.
Well, I agree in part, but not entirely. And but what I do think is very important for all of us to understand, I think we all feel it also, almost every day in some sense, is that we are at a watershed moment in history. I don't think it's exactly passing the baton, say, from the United States to China, which is how it's often discussed. What I do think is true is that we're at the end of a 500-year cycle in history. 500 years ago was the beginning of Europe's ascent to global power. And it came basically, when one looks back, because of two decisive voyages at the end of the 15th century. Christopher Columbus thought he was going to India, and he ended up in the Americas instead. Vasco da Gama was aiming to go to Asia. He circled the Cape of Good Hope, the southern tip of Africa, and with the help of Arab sailors, made it to India. So within 10 years, 1492 for Columbus and 1498 for Vasco da Gama's voyage, suddenly Europe had sea routes to the whole world. And part of the world was not even known, of course, to the Europeans up to that point, the Americas. This, in my view, changed human history for the next 5 centuries. It's a long story, of course, exactly what happened. But basically, Europe's control over the Americas was a decisive change of relative power in the world. Even that story of Europe's control over the Americas needs a footnote that's interesting, because a few European conquerors conquered a continent that had about 100 million people in it in the year 1492 when Christopher Columbus arrived. And so you might ask, how did Europe conquer the Americas, which had native populations all through the Americas. And the answer was not military conquest primarily. They brought diseases, which the New World populations didn't know. So the New World was conquered by yellow fever, by typhus, by plague, by malaria, by other diseases brought by the Europeans. But the point is that within a century, the native population had been reduced by 95%, and the Europeans had two giant continents for minerals, for gold, for silver, for agriculture, for colonization. And this was a change of human history. And I raise this point because, to my mind, this is the start of a 500-year period. By around 1750, the European global empires, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the British, which were the ocean empires, had enough power now to start conquering Asia and Africa. They actually couldn't make it into Africa yet because malaria was a protective barrier for Africa. In fact, every time the Europeans went to Africa to try to conquer, they were defeated by the mosquito more than the local populations. What enabled Africa to be colonized, which only happened at the end of the 19th century, was gin and tonic. Because tonic is quinine, and quinine is an ancient Peruvian cure for fever. And it was studied by the British. The seeds were stolen and brought back to Kew Gardens. It was cultivated. It was introduced into gin and tonic. And then the British could sit on their verandas and rule over Africa by the end of the 19th century, protected from malaria. In Asia, where the disease burden didn't protect, by the end of the 18th century, Europe really started to beat up the Asians, because by then Europe was militarily dominant. It had better technology. For many reasons of the story that I'm telling, a scientific revolution accompanied this age of globalism. And Europe, basically from around 1750 onward, started to colonize Asia. And India, for example, by the end of the 18th century was substantially in British hands and fell completely to British hands in 1857. And when it came to China, China was the most powerful empire in the world, the most populous country in the world, and it hadn't really been bothered by the outside, and it hadn't bothered the outside for many centuries, in fact. So when the British arrived in what's called the Macartney mission to China in 1795 and met Qianlong, the emperor of the Qing dynasty, the emperor said, "We don't want to trade with you. You have nothing we want," and sent the mission away. And the British came back 44 years later, this time with gunboats in the Pearl River Delta. And that was the first Opium War, telling the Chinese, you're going to buy our opium whether you want it or not. And in fact, the Chinese did not want the opium. I'm thinking, as Donald Trump talks about narco-trafficking, he wouldn't like actually narcotics traffickers saying you have to open up your borders to our trade. But that's what the British did to the Chinese in 1839. And what ensued was the first Opium War from 1839 to 1842. And then the next decade, the Second Opium War, joined by the French, this time burning down the Summer Palace. If you know the Summer Palace in Beijing, it's one of the most beautiful places and historic places. It should not be burned down. But this was European empires showing their dominance of Asia. And then China went into civil war, perhaps the most devastating civil war in history, the Taiping Rebellion, it's called, but it was really essentially a civil war. But the point is that by 1900, Europe completely dominated the world. And that was the world that was expected to last forever. 11 years ago, VUC held a very wonderful conference here on the 100th anniversary of World War I. That's notable because that was the beginning of the end of the European-led world. Because as of 1900, there was almost no way for Asian or for African or for Latin American countries to have a chance in this world. Britain basically controlled almost everything, and the parts that Britain didn't control were controlled by France or controlled by a few other powers. The United States was still not even barely present because it had spent the 19th century not on international empires but on creating a continental scale empire in North America because it had to defeat all of the native populations still. So 1900, Europe dominated. 1914, for reasons that are so tragic, absurd, stupid, without any justification that you could think of in a deep way, Europe went into a cataclysmic civil war. Started nearby here in Sarajevo, of course, for absolutely no reason, I would say. No deep reason, no justification, no fundamental conflicts, no struggle for survival. It was a booming period in history. But Europe thought it would be a glorious one-month war, and it turned out to be a 4-year bloodbath, followed by a Great Depression, followed by another bloodbath. I mentioned all of this basic history because Europe defeated itself, so that by 1950, this European-led world would undergo a fundamental change. And that was the rise of the non-Western world, suddenly permissible, allowed because European empires had destroyed each other in the process. So the People's Republic of China finally escaped from a century of outside depredation. First the British, the French, the British, the French, the Americans, then the Japanese, then the Japanese, then the Japanese, and then finally peace and the People's Republic of China established in 1949. And India gained its independence in 1947. And Indochina would have gained its independence around the same time in the early 1950s, but when the French decided to leave, the United States decided to come in and try to maintain imperial rule, but U.S. imperial rule. And of course that led to 15 years of bloodshed in the Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos war. So Vuk, from my point of view, what happened basically in history is Europe came to dominate the world. Europe destroyed its own dominance in a 50-year period from in a 30-year period from 1914 to 1945 in two bloodbaths that were European bloody-mindedness. The U.S. took over the British Empire in 1945, almost like handing the baton in a relay race. The Soviet Union, mainly Russia, it was a dominant empire for Eurasia already, but it became one of the two world's superpowers in 1945 and onward. And what began in 1950, but it wasn't really understood, was the opening for the rest of the world to find its place in a world that had been controlled by Europe. And the control is interesting. What did the European empires do? They did three things. They extracted anything they could of value, so minerals and agriculture products and everything else. Second, they prevented the local populations from getting a decent education or having even basic infrastructure, and they prevented industrialization from taking place because that was for the European empires. There was only one exception to that in Asia, and that was Japan, for a lot of very interesting reasons. But other than that, basically Europe stopped the progress outside, and the end of the European empires allowed a natural process because there's smart people everywhere, there are entrepreneurs everywhere, there's business energy everywhere, there's experience everywhere. But it was bottled up by European dominance. That was ended. The U.S. wasn't exactly the same kind of empire. I'm sure we'll talk about that.
We're going to talk about that.
But just to say, we arrived in the year 2000 in really a new world. And what is this new world? The new world is that China did such a good job that it had become already, I would say, 25 years ago, a superpower. And now it is a peer of the United States in technology and in its military might and in every other way. And that's something different. Russia, the same way. Russia was regarded by the United States first as an enemy during the Cold War, and then as a has-been after 1991. And that was also delusional by the U.S. and Europe, that Russia, we don't have to care. We can do whatever we want. We can expand NATO. We can try to topple regimes around Russia. We can surround Russia. We can defeat Russia. We can bring down Russia. So that was another delusion. So now we have a multipolar world. That's the fundamental point. And just to finish, because I want to say why I partly disagree with the title, I don't think it's really the Asian century. I think it's the world century now. Because I think that, yes, Asia in the sense, China, a major power, absolutely wonderful in my view. India will be a major power in the 21st century, and a very important and positive one. But when we come back and do this event in 2050, Vuk, which we will, promise me, we'll say, look what Africa did during that 25-year period. And you'll say, and Jeff, you said so.
Yeah, I mean,